Hi, my name is Leandro Facchinetti, and in this video I want to talk about free or cheap hosting for web applications. This space can be overwhelming. Recently I was trying to deploy one of my own applications and I decided to just take a look at the market again after using the same tools for many years. And some things have changed. There are better options these days and I looked into them and I want to share with you some of the things I learned. I am not endorsed by any of these companies. In fact, I don't make money in any of my side projects, including these videos, and that's why I'm focusing on free and cheap options because I don't want to pour a lot of money into side projects that are mostly for fun. I'm going to talk about these tools from the simplest to the most sophisticated. There are different options with different trade-offs. I'll talk about what they are, what they're good for, and so you don't have to keep waiting. The tools I'm going to talk about are Github Pages, Versal, Heroku, and Digitalocean. So let's start with GitHub Pages. What is this and what is it good for? Well, GitHub Pages is for hosting a static website. So if you have a website that is mainly HTML, CSS, some JavaScript, images, maybe some PDFs, and very small songs and videos, then GitHub Pages is for you. If you have longer videos, then you're probably better served with something like YouTube or archive.org, but for the rest of the website, you can host it on GitHub Pages. And what they do is just serve the files. They are also able to build using Jekyll, and if you are using Jekyll as a static website generator, which you might not want to do, take a look at this other video that is linked on the description below about you might not need a static website generator, but in case you are using Jekyll, then GitHub Pages may be good for you because it is built into GitHub Pages. GitHub Pages is good for things like a web page for some software project, maybe with documentation, maybe just a marketing page. That's actually the use case for GitHub Pages. But if you have a personal blog or a personal website linking to some social networks, some very simple stuff, maybe even some simple business page that you have, GitHub Pages is good for all that, even portfolios, blogs, and so forth. And the advantage of using GitHub Pages is that it is simple to set up. If you're watching this, then chances are you already have a GitHub account. It is a service that is used all over the place, backed by Microsoft. It's never going to go away. So GitHub Pages is solid. It's super simple to configure. If you already have a project that is on GitHub, then enabling GitHub Pages is probably just a matter of going into the settings and clicking on one button. That is it. And you have your website online. But there are some downsides to GitHub Pages. The first is something that annoys me a lot. I complained about this to the GitHub support on day one when I started using GitHub Pages on my projects. GitHub Pages was new back then. They never solved this problem to these days. Many years have passed. The issue is if you have a website with a custom domain, that is both a top-level domain like example.com, and also you want to serve the website on a subdomain like www.example.com, and you want to enable HTTPS, then there is one small glitch. If you try to access HTTPS www.example.com, then it works. But if you try to access HTTPS example.com without the www, the certificate doesn't cover that domain, so you get an error saying that the certificate is invalid, you are not redirected to the right page. If you just go to http example.com, then it redirects correctly because there is no need for a certificate in that case. GitHub just sends you to the right address. But that can be annoying. It's a small glitch. Most people would never run into this when trying to access your website. It's just something to be aware of. Also, if you're hosting on GitHub Pages, your repository has to be public. Unless you are paying, but the whole point of this video is that you don't want to pay much for hosting. So unless you have a paid account, deploying to GitHub Pages is only available for public repositories. And in some cases, I had projects in which I wanted to remain anonymous, so I had to create a whole GitHub account just to be able to host the repository that I had to make public. to have a GitHub Pages website. So it can be annoying if you want to keep things closed source for some reason. Also, when deploying to GitHub Pages, I sometimes notice a lag. It's usually minor. It's usually just 1 or 2 minutes, at most, I guess, 5 minutes. But the problem is there is no easy way for you to look at the build and see where things are, or if they are stalling, you may have something like wait 30 more seconds, something like that. Well, in GitHub Pages, there's nothing like that. You could just have to keep refreshing and waiting for the site to deploy. So yeah, that's a downside. Okay, so let's say you want to graduate from GitHub Pages to something a little bit more sophisticated, but still very simple to use. Well, I guess my next recommendation would be Versal. This is a new thing somewhat. The name Versal is, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, by the way, but I'm calling it Versal. Vercel, maybe? I don't know. Anyway, this name is new. They used to be called Zeit Now, but now they are called Versal. And at the core, they are similar to GitHub Pages in the sense that they host static files. But they also have one extra feature called Serverless Functions. And what they are is just a snippet of code that you can run on the backend. So if you have something like a form submission that you need to process, you have a contact form, some very simple stuff, and you just want to maybe process this form and send an email to someone. It's something that is simply impossible to do using GitHub Pages alone or using static websites alone. You need some backend to actually send the email and actually process the form. Serverless functions are a simple way to process forms and do simple tasks like that. Maybe something that needs to run periodically, like sending emails on a newsletter every night, something like that. Those are things that you can do with serverless functions. So I think of Versal as GitHub Pages plus the serverless functions and other things that are nice. They have a separation of environments. You can deploy to staging and then production. But usually for personal projects, small things, you wouldn't have to care about all this separation. You just want to deploy to production every time in most cases. But anyway, it's good to have this. I would say that Versal is good for maybe you just want to have a static website, but you don't want to use GitHub Pages because of the www thing that I was explaining before. They don't have that issue. Or you just think that you may need serverless functions in the future. Or you don't want to make your repository public, because you can deploy your project to Versal, going through GitHub if you want, and then every time you push, you deploy to Versal, but you can also deploy from your machine directly to Versal, private repository, no one has to see it. You may even have a private repository on GitHub and deploy to that as well if you want. Then your private repository will be linked to Versal. I never tried this, but I suppose it would work. And one more thing that I think Versal is good for is this serverless functions thing. I think they're super useful. Just one nicety on top of a static website is just usually the case that you need to process like a contact form. So I think it's super nice to have the serverless functions, and the serverless functions are super easy to develop using Versal. You should know that there is some vendor locking. You have to use Versal to deploy this, and you have to use Versal in development as well. You are not just writing like a bare metal node server or something with Express or Ruby on Rails. No, you have to buy into their way of building the serverless functions. But I think it's a good trade-off because the development tools are great. You just npm install Versal and then you say Versal dev, and you are good to go. You're off to the races. You can run the serverless functions on your machine, test things out, set up environment variables, control them through the web interface on versal.com. So I think it's great. It's really a good option for just a static website or a static website with a few dynamic features on the backend. And I should say that the setup is super simple too. For the serverless functions, all you have to do is create a /API folder on your project, your static website. And then in that folder, you can put some JavaScript files. They also support other languages like Ruby, TypeScript. You just put a script there, you follow their convention on how to get the request and send a response. And then the file name is the root for the API. So if you have a file named /API/process form, then you can go to your website /API/process form, and a request will be sent to the serverless function. It's as simple as that. Now let's move on to the next option, which is Heroku. Heroku is a platform as a service, so it's not only running a function, it's running a whole application. In Heroku, you could have an application that serves both the front end and the back end, all in a single app, similar to what you can do in Versal. The difference here is that Heroku is not just running one piece of an API file somewhere. It's not just running one function. It's literally spinning up a whole server, and you can do whatever you want with it. So in effect, it's like if you had a machine that is tailored for the kind of application that you have. And the way this works is Heroku looks at your application and it finds a package.json. Then it realizes that it's a Node application and it starts a machine that already has Node installed. Or maybe you have a gem file. And then in that case, Heroku will figure that you have a Ruby project. And it will come up with a machine that has Ruby already installed and then run your application. So in most cases, you don't have to configure anything. Like with these other options, you just follow conventions from your programming language and everything will just follow out. It will just work. So Heroku is like a machine prepared to run your application, and you just have to give the code for the application. But this time it's not a static website. It's a server full application with a server that is listening on some port and that may have some static parts, but also some dynamic parts. They just go along with each other. So the difference between the function as a service from Versal and a platform as a service with Heroku is that you have a lot more control. You have routes that you can manage whatever way you want. You don't have to follow that convention of using the file system. And you can easily plug with other parts of the Heroku ecosystem. For instance, the database. They have a Postgres database that you can attach to your application that is already running. And in Versal, in theory, you could attach a serverless function to a Heroku database, but then the application would have to go through the network to fetch data from the database. And that's not ideal. It slows things down. And it doesn't make sense to run an application and a database on completely different services. So yeah, in theory, you could run your whole application on Heroku, both front-end and back-end. But there are a few downsides to doing this. And I think it's better to run Heroku as a backend and something else like GitHub Pages or Versal as a frontend. And then your static website is just calling an API on Heroku. And I think that's better for a couple reasons. First, and probably the most important, if you are on the free and cheap options, then it is SSL. You probably want a custom domain and you want HTTPS on that custom domain. And on the free tier, Heroku does not give you HTTPS for custom domains. And for me, that is a deal breaker. I always want to have my own custom domains, and I want SSL, I want HTTPS in everything I do. So I have to use something like Versal or GitHub Pages to give me HTTPS on the main part of the app. And then the API calls can go to something on Heroku domain, which is yourapplication.herokuapp.com. Then these API calls happen behind the curtains, so the users never see the API calls. And then you have the appearance of HTTPS everywhere. Well, you have HTTPS everywhere, and you have the appearance of your domain. But then your application comes in two parts. It's harder to deploy. It's annoying in many ways. For one thing, you have to set up cores, the cross-origin thing, to make it possible for the front-end to call the backend. And that's not hard to do. You just have to use a library called cores in Node.js. And in other languages, there are similarly easy setups, but it's annoying. It's one more thing that you have to do. So Heroku is great if you already have an application that is front-end and back-end, or maybe just the back-end, but you already have the application and it's a server-full application and you don't want to buy into the Versal way of doing serverless functions, then I think Heroku may be the best option for you. But there is one more wrinkle. There is one more thing that is annoying on Heroku, and you should know about this. When you're running your app on Heroku, if you're using the free tier, it will shut down, and after I think 30 minutes of inactivity, it will shut down. And then the next request you send, Heroku has to spin up the server again, which takes something like 15 to 30 seconds. So your user will be annoyed by this long wait. And that happens often if your side project isn't super popular, then your app will go to sleep frequently and your users will have to wait frequently, which is annoying. And there are two more things you should know about Heroku. One is about the custom domains that I was talking about. Even if you wanted to just have HTTP for some reason, you don't care about HTTPS and you are willing to use Heroku with a custom domain, then there is one wrinkle. You cannot assign a top-level domain like example.com to a Heroku machine without some hackery on DNS. So they have instructions on how to do this. They are linked below if you want to try it. But it's just one more thing that you have to know about. There is this extra step to take if you want to use a top-level domain. If you want to use something like www.example.com, it just works very easily. But for top-level domains, all the other options I mentioned, Versal and GitHub Pages, they work better because you just have an IP address that you have to create a DNS entry for. It's much simpler to set up. But in many cases, the DNS servers that you want to use already have these extra features that are required by the Heroku, so it just works. But I find it annoying anyway. And the second thing you should know is that Heroku comes with all these add-ons, one of which I mentioned, the database, but there are others. And Heroku runs the database, so that works perfectly every time. But with other add-ons, they should work. But for me, for one reason or another, they always fail in some strange way. Recently, I was trying to set up a server to send emails. So I tried to use the add-on for SendGrid. It didn't work. It just, instead of opening the dashboard, it opened a blank page every time. I don't know why that is. I went to sendgrid.com and created an account there and set up the integration manually, and then it worked. So I have no idea what was going on. It has to do with the Heroku add-on. My advice is, if you want to use a third party, just go to the third party, create an account there, and then connect everything by hand. It works better that way, or at least it did for me. Anyway, finally, let's talk about our last option. It's Digitalocean. It's both the most sophisticated and the most difficult to configure. It is just a machine. Digitalocean is infrastructure as a service. All they do is they give you a machine, and if you want, there are some machines that you can select from. You can select, instead of Ubuntu, I want to use Fedora, and so on and so forth. And when selecting these options, there are some that come with software already installed. There is an image with Docker, there is an image with Node and Ruby, and so forth. So it can be almost as simple as Heroku in some ways, but you must know that in the end of the day, there is no management for you. It's just running a machine with your code on it. It doesn't know about the application that you have, and it doesn't auto-update things. It doesn't scale automatically. You have to do all these things by hand. They're just giving you a machine. So in some ways, it is the best option because you can configure anything you want. You can have access to things that you wouldn't have access to in all these other options I mentioned. For one thing, you have access to the file system. You can write files like images on the file system. And that, if you have a lot of files, it is much simpler to configure than having to use some external storage. If you are using Versal or Heroku for something like images, you have to store your images somewhere else, and you have to integrate your app in a way that goes fetch these images in other places. Even something as simple as creating an avatar can be a nightmare in some of these cases, because you have to go through some object storage mechanism like S3 in AWS, and yeah, just trust me, it can get very annoying. But with Digitalocean, you just have a machine with a file system, so you can just write the file to the file system and it will be there. Of course, it won't have all the niceties of duplication all over the world, but Digitalocean has a good backup system, so I don't think you're ever going to lose any files. It's just a matter of serving them faster, and if your application is simple and small, then you're probably good. In the worst case, you can probably use some other tool on top of your application to make things faster. But trust me, it's probably good enough. I have some very big projects that occupy, I think, like tens of gigabytes worth of small files. It would be super annoying to do this with S3 or some other tool like that, but using the file system, it's a breeze. So you have a lot of control, and that's good. But it's also a burden. You have to configure everything by hand. You have to install the libraries and the language that you were working with. So DigitalOcean, it's a lot more work to set up. But once you get it set up, it's great. And there is one thing that makes me go to DigitalOcean for one project in particular, and that is the bandwidth. With all the other options, you have to pay for bandwidth out of pocket if you have things like images or videos. But with DigitalOcean, because everything is in the file system, and because you can just serve from your machine, it can get a lot cheaper. And I'm talking about a difference between, in my particular project, I pay $5 a month. That's the least expensive plan on DigitalOcean. By the way, that's a downside. There is no free tier in DigitalOcean. But with this $5 plan, that actually turns out to be $6 because I pay for backup. But anyway, with this $5 plan, I can serve around 500 gigabytes worth of data every month, and I don't have to pay any extra. Using things like S3, I would probably pay around $50 per month just for the bandwidth. Never mind the computer that actually needs to run the application. I guess Heroku or something like that. That would add some more dollars to the bill. So yeah, DigitalOcean is the cheapest option for bandwidth. And I'm thinking about things like if you have videos or if you have lots of files that people are constantly getting and you have to pay for bandwidth, you should consider using DigitalOcean. It comes with 1 terabyte per month on the $5 plan, which is probably good enough for most small and hobby applications. And still, it's relatively cheap. And there you have it. Go to Github Pages, Versal, Heroku, or DigitalOcean and deploy your awesome web applications. Thanks for watching.